Hello, how are you? Nice shirt tie combo.
Secretary Bernhardt, thank you for being here this morning. And we're here to discuss President Trump's fourth budget request. And unsurprisingly, it's a repeat of the prior three budgets, once again proposing devastating cuts that Congress will never enact. It is disappointing, however, because it walks back the bipartisan agreement that was just enacted into law last year. For fiscal year 2021, the Interior Department is seeking a $1.9 billion cut, or 14% from fiscal year 2020 through enacted levels for the bureaus and programs funded through the Interior Appropriations bill. It would slash the U.S. Geological Survey budget by 24%. It would eliminate the landscape conservation cooperatives and science support at Fish and Wildlife Service. Essentially, this budget would undo all the progress we made last year advancing science. It would also cut funding for historic preservation by 66%, eliminating grants our communities rely on to protect our nation's historic and cultural resources. It would starve the National Park Service of funding critical to maintaining positive visitor experiences in the parks. It would abandon investments made in Indian country by cutting $421 million from the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Indian Education funding. So let me be clear, this budget will not be enacted as proposed. However, the unrealistic funding levels in the Trump budget cause needless worry by many Americans who care about our public lands, our federal employees, and the volunteers who protect them, and the parents who educate their children through the Bureau of Indian Education funding. In short, your tenure as Secretary, you've laid out an ambitious plan, and it's remarkable, damaging to our environment, our public health, and our natural resources. And you've been executing it at a staggering pace. Your desire to dismantle the Bureau of Land Management's headquarters is likely to cost the agency more than 75% of its most knowledgeable and experienced land managers, and that's a level of damage that will be felt for decades. Your use of Federal Lands Recreation Enhancement Act fees was found to be illegal by the Government Accountability Office. Yet you continue to use these fees for day-to-day operations in violation of the law and sending a message to your staff that the law does not matter. And your overzealousness desire to circumvent environmental laws and regulations in order to serve the interests of the oil and gas industry has led to endless rounds of litigation. This is costing the American taxpayers millions of dollars. Just 2 weeks ago, for example, a federal judge ruled BLM's attempt to limit public input was, and I quote from the judge, arbitrary and capricious. Public input is a cornerstone of our democracy. Actions like these erode the trust between the Congress and the administration, and that does not serve the American people well. Furthermore, the administration's relentless efforts to undermine the integrity of science must be stopped. The department's science programs provide data and tools to inform sound decisions when addressing complex challenges such as drought, natural disaster, and climate change. Scientific integrity is essential to ensure that there's no bias or preconceived agenda in any information issued by the department. 2 years ago, I expressed my concern over the department's senior leadership intervention in the U.S. Geological Survey's policies regarding unpublished USGS data. Today, I continue to be outraged to see this type of unacceptable behavior is continuing. March 2nd, 2020, the New York Times article detailed the steps taken by the Deputy Secretary's office to insert misleading language about climate change into the agency's scientific reports, including environmental studies and impact statements. Just right here. Political interference at BLM's decision-making process with respect to resource management plans is a documented fact. Mr. Secretary, we both know that actions speak louder than words, and the department's actions on confronting climate change, biodiversity, species protection, and land management really bring into question the stewardship that's happening under your tenure. Our nation's cultural and natural resources are to be cherished and protected. The President's budget, which you're presenting today, would further diminish the Interior's Department's ability to fulfill its mission. It is the federal government's responsibility to protect our natural and cultural resources, both for today and as a legacy we leave for future generations. So Congress will be doing its part to uphold that responsibility by rejecting this harmful proposed budget. And with that, I would yield to Ranking Member Mr. Joyce for any opening remarks he would like to make.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Bernhardt, I'd like to welcome you to your second hearing before the subcommittee. Thank you for your dedicated work at the department over the years and for being here today to discuss the department's proposed budget for the fiscal year 21. I also want to thank you for committing to keep us regularly updated on the status of the relocation of the Bureau of Land Management staff as the process concludes later this fiscal year. I think we all share an interest in keeping the trains running at BLM while also doing everything we can for the dedicated public servants whose lives have been impacted by this relocation. The budget before us today proposes a 14% cut to the Department of Interior and cuts many programs that Congress and the President agreed to fund less than 3 months ago when the fiscal year 20 appropriation was signed into law. I don't want to spend much time today debating most of these cuts, but I am interested in learning more about where the department is trying to go in fiscal year 21 and why, as well as the challenges the department faces and opportunities for us to work together to try and do something about them. Two opportunities made headlines just last week when the President, the House, and the Senate leadership expressed strong support for moving two bills which directly impact the work we do in this subcommittee. The first bill would be to provide $9.5 billion to help reduce the maintenance backlog at our national parks and other important areas. While an infusion of funds is certainly welcome, it cannot let us and the department off the hook through the regular annual appropriations process. That is why I respectfully disagree with the deferred maintenance and construction cuts proposed in the budget. The second bill would provide a permanent annual appropriation of $900 million to implement the Land and Water Conservation Act at its fully authorized level. If enacted, this subcommittee would be relieved of its funding responsibility. But I hope that we will continue our strong oversight role to ensure that the lands acquired are from willing sellers and with the consent of local governments. When we talk about the permanent appropriations, it's impossible not to think of the federal government's inseparable moral and legal obligations to the American Indians and Alaska Natives. Our government still has a long way to go before fully meeting these obligations. That is why I'm deeply concerned about the $421 million cuts from the budget for the tribal programs. While most of these proposed cuts may legally be discretionary, morally they are not. To be clear, I applaud the proposed increases like those to address the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous people, but we cannot take one step forward and 2 steps back with the Indian country budget. Again, I do want to give you credit for many of the advancements proposed in this budget, such as investing in U.S. energy security and ensuring a reliable supply of critical minerals, proactively managing forests and hazardous fuel loads, and improving access to existing public lands. These are goals I think we all share, even if we may slightly disagree about the speed and manner in which we achieve them. And I look forward to working with you and Chair McCollum as we go through this process in order to achieve these goals and other mutual goals. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention some of the other goals for me and my constituents back home. The Great Lakes are our lifeblood, and we've been working very hard to restore them and protect them against future threats like the Asian carp. The budget proposes cuts to Asian carp control and other important programs that reduce harmful algal blooms. We need to keep our foot on the gas with these investments until we've solved all of our problems. So we have some work ahead of us with this budget, and I remain committed to doing so in a bipartisan way with my chair and the rest of my colleagues on the subcommittee, and Mr. Secretary, with you and your excellent team at Interior. Thank you again for being here today. I look forward to your testimony and to our discussion. I thank the chair for yielding me this time, and I yield back.
Thank you. I thank my fellow Great Lakes companion here for always looking out for the Great Lakes. With that, Mr. Secretary, we will turn to your testimony. Your full testimony will be entered into the record. And with that, we will start, and there you have a box in front of you with the time element on it. So please move forward with your testimony. We appreciate you being here. Thank you.
So thank you for inviting me here to discuss the President's 2021 budget request. for the Department of the Interior. I'm not sure if I need to ask this since you said it would be inserted, but I'd appreciate making sure that my statement is fully inserted in the record. And before I turn to the budget proposal, given Representative Joyce's comments, I think it is notable that last week the President called on Congress to send him a bill that fully and permanently funds the Land and Water Conservation Fund and restores our national parks. And President Trump is the first president in the 171 years at the Department of the Interior to call for both of these programs to be funded in a mandatory way. The enactment of such legislation would be historic. Members of this subcommittee, actually on both sides of the aisle, have been working on this issue, these two issues, for years. And I believe the President's unprecedented support for these items together is extremely significant, and we would encourage Congress to be expeditious in their deliberation of that matter. As the subcommittee knows well, the Department's mission directly affects Americans across the country. The President has been clear in his direction and priorities and his ambitious goals, challenging federal agencies to deliver better results. The 2021 budget will allow us to continue advancing key priorities. As Chair McCollum said, our budget is roughly $12.8 billion in current authority. We would also continue to have access to an additional $310 million in the event of severe wildfire season. We estimate there will be an additional $7.5 billion in permanent authority available, including grants and payments for specific activities that do not require appropriation. The budget continues to prioritize taking care of the lands and resources we oversee, expanding access to those areas for public recreation and enjoyment, and investing to improve visitor experience at our sites. We are also proposing several targeted investments to advance specific priorities that I would like you to consider. The first, and it is very significant, is that we propose to strengthen the Department's wildfire and active forest management capacity. We have proposed an additional $50 million that we believe would go a very long way towards adding full-time firefighters. I've done a number of things in looking at our firefighting capability and our treatment capability. And we've extended the number of hours for seasonal employees. I think adding this element of additional career folks would be very beneficial. Those two things together would give us about 700,000 additional man-hours of effort. When I've looked at our activity rate with wildfire, it's clear to me that we save hours at the beginning of the year, worried about a broader fire season later. And given the time, let me raise one other issue that I think it would really be useful for you to consider, and that is that for the first time since the 90s, a new Inspector General was confirmed last summer. He has some great ideas that I really would like you to give consideration to. He has an idea for placing a new strategic emphasis on Indian country fraud and mismanagement, particularly in the construction of schools. That should be white-collar crime issues that everybody should be able to get behind. He also is focused on creating a multi-tiered data analysis program to better analyze activities and expenditures. And I think that would be something that would be interesting to you in terms of a return on investment. A modest increase in the Inspector General's budget could go a long ways in terms of returning money for the taxpayer. The President looked hard at the budget, and he decided that this would our budget fit within those parameters. I recognize fully, as Chairman McCollum, that the President proposes and you completely dispose of our budget. So with that, I'm happy to answer your questions.
Mr. Quigley has to chair an appropriations subcommittee at 10 o'clock, so I'm going to defer to Mr. Quigley for the first question.
Will the chair yield for one moment?
Yes, I will.
Just so everybody understands, Secretary, that Tom Graves is also our ranking member on that committee. His son was in a horrible accident and so Mark Amadei, who's also a member of this committee, as well as Chris Stewart and I, we're the other members of the Financial Services of Mr. Quigley's committee. Mr. Amadei will be up there as your co-chair or your ranking member, and then at some point, we're going to hope to switch, and maybe Chris can go up there so Mark can come down and ask his questions, but just so when people will be shifting in and out. Thank you.
You know,
And I thank the chairwoman for her indulgence. Mr. Secretary, you answered a written question to Senator Hirono last year that you were, quote, aware of no case in which the Interior Department had purposely withheld or improperly delayed the sharing of scientific information with the public where disclosure was appropriate. In 2018, the director of USGS, James Riley, asked scientists to gin up emission figures so that he and other Trump appointees could craft a good story about how carbon emissions from wildfires compared to fossil fuels. The goal was ostensibly to justify cutting forest protection efforts. 2017, then Deputy Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals Management, Catherine McGregor, canceled a study examining the health impacts of mountaintop coal mining after holding a significant number of meetings with mining companies. Just last week, the New York Times published a story about an Interior employer who is well known within the department for inserting inaccurate and misleading information, highlighting the uncertainty of climate change into at least 9 major DOI reports. Sir, under your leadership, the Department of Interior seems intent on subjugating scientific land management and conservation to political and corporate purposes. Mr. Secretary, were you aware of these instances, and is the Department taking action to ensure that you, as Secretary, are aware of cases where scientific information is improperly withheld, delayed, or altered?
So science obviously plays a critical role in the work that we do every day. I spend a lot of time with scientists, and on my watch, for the first time in decades, we have a career science advisor in the Secretary's office. His name is Bill Werkheiser. He was with the U.S. Geological Survey for years. Before he came into my office, he was the department's chief scientific integrity officer. And any time we have something that raises a question about scientific integrity, I ask him to look at it. And here's a couple of facts for you, sir. In 2017, 2018, and 2019, the number of formal scientific integrity complaints filed at the Department of the Interior is down substantially from the years 2012, 13, 14, 15, and 16. That's a fact.
So back to my question. Were you aware of these 3 instances?
Anytime I hear about an instance, I ask Bill to look at it.
Were you aware of these 3?
Well, I certainly am aware of the New York Times article, and when we looked at it, the email traffic that I've seen so far is a back and forth between experts, and that's what it is. Happy to provide you those documents and let you review them yourself.
Back to my question. Were you aware of these 3 instances, and did you, I'll add, did you investigate this beyond looking at an email path as whether or not this
We've looked at it for whether or
employee
not
was doing this?
Let me be very clear. We are looking at that matter. I think it's unlikely it amounts to a issue of scientific misconduct. It's a back and forth between experts.
Okay. Just because I'm a glutton for punishment, I'll ask if you are aware of the 2017 incident with Catherine McGregor canceling a study about the impacts of mountaintop coal mining.
I'm certainly aware that the study was canceled.
And were you told why it was canceled?
I think it occurred before I was there, but I'm happy to look at that.
you were aware of it, did you investigate it after the fact?
There's not
Given
it's
there's
not
still
a
need a,
question. It's not a question of scientific integrity.
okay, let's just pretend it's not a question of scientific integrity. It still matters because it impacts the Department of Interior and its reasoning and efforts going forward.
So let me be very clear with
You're
what I
being really
expect.
the
What I
opposite of
expect-
clear.
What
would
I
you-
expect is that we take the science as it comes. For every decision, I have an element of fact, which is whatever the facts are. We don't change facts. We can't change the facts. The facts are the facts. We have an element of law, and we have an element of policy. For virtually every decision I make, there's some combination of those three factors.
Why would you
And we
cancel?
always-
Why would they cancel this study? Did anyone tell you why?
I know there have been explanations provided, and I'm happy to provide you the explanations.
So that's 2 out of 3. And on the 2018, James Riley asking scientists to gin up emissions figures. Were you aware of this?
I was not, but I do know that gin up is a word that James Riley has used. He used it in front of me yesterday, and I told him that may not be the best word to utilize.
Okay, so if you could
I think what
investigate
he
all
meant.
3
I
and
think
get
he
back
meant.
to us.
I think what he meant when he said that was
To be clear?
let's put it together, not create artificially.
Respectfully, it
which is
sounds a
your
lot more
assumption.
opaque than clear when you say gin up. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you, Mr. Quigley. I'm always no longer finding myself not shocked when scientific studies are canceled. As you've heard me speak many, many times about the Forest Service scientific study into whether or not sulfide copper ore mining could be done safely in the boundary waters. Mr. Joyce.
Thank you, Chair McCollum. I will yield at this time to my distinguished colleague, Representative Stewart.
Thank you, distinguished ranking member and chairwoman for Secretary. It's great to have you here. Thank you. I know this is a tough job, tough environment, part of it, but I think you do a great job. I'm actually going to take some time and thank you for 3 or 4 specific things, and then ask you about one. First, just in general, thank you for your support of maintaining access to public lands in the West. As people are tired of hearing me say, I have some counties in my district that are 92% owned and controlled by the federal government. It destroys the tax base for those counties, and limiting access, not just for recreational, but for some commercial purposes, is very important. We're thankful for that. Thanks for your help on wild horses, and thanks to the chairwoman and other members of this committee. This has been a long road for us, so I think we've come to a point where we recognize there's a problem, and that if we want healthy horses and healthy rangeland, that we have to deal with them in a different way than we are, or than we have been. And to all of us who have helped me on that, to all of you who have helped me on that, thank you. Number 3, park access to national parks. We have these incredibly beautiful places in my district, Zion National Park, Bryce, and others. And the good news is a lot of people want to come and enjoy these incredible vistas. The bad news is a lot of people want to come and enjoy these incredible places, and it can get very crowded. Well, we don't think the answer is to limit access and limit the number of visitors. I appreciated in previous conversations with you that you seem to agree with that, and then instead let's build out facilities and invite people to come and enjoy it. And then 4th, and I know that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle may disagree with this, but I think the move of the headquarters agency is exactly the right thing. I think it changes the culture. I think it brings those who regulate and control these lands in proximity with the neighbors and friends that are most impacted by it. And I was really interested in, I'd ask you to comment on this if you would, because I think it is a great point and worth mentioning. That is, the quality of the resumes and the people that you think are going to take some of these positions is actually very, very notable, and I'd ask you to comment on that. And then finally, my question, geothermal royalties to counties. You have proposed a 25% reduction in that. Right now, they split that with the federal government. You're saying that the counties are going to take a 25% hit. Again, these are counties that are entirely dependent on the federal government almost, and the 25% is hardly anything to the federal government. It's enormous to them, plus they have to maintain the infrastructure. Ask you to please reconsider on that. Mr. Secretary.
So let me take those in reverse order. First off, thanks for the comments. On geothermal, we'll work with you on that. I appreciate the negative impact. Let me say this, and
So I'm going to quote you. You'll work with us on that, right?
absolutely,
Okay,
like
all right.
really work with you on
Okay,
it.
thank you.
I found the comments regarding the relocation of BLM to be outlandish, and let me tell you why. I know full well what we need to do to build a better BLM. And the concept that we're doing something to tear it down is fundamentally flawed, And let me give you a major reality check. The number and quality of the people we have applying for positions in Grand Junction and these other western communities is phenomenal. High-quality folks within the department, high-quality folks within BLM, and high-quality folks outside of the department. And when I go to the field, and visit field offices, which I would encourage you to do, they are ecstatic that things are moving forward with this relocation. So that is a fact. It may not be a fact people agree with, but it is a fact, and we'll have it up and running. And by December 2020, what we're going to see is a phenomenal operation. So I am very comfortable with that decision.
Madam Chair, I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, we've had several conversations, and as you know, this committee takes its oversight role very seriously. And I continue to be very troubled by the department's lack of responsiveness even to the most customary requests. Last April, we held a budget hearing with the National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife, and USGS. We notified the witnesses that we would have questions for the record, and we asked for responses in 30 days. Those questions for the record were transmitted to the department on April 16, 2019, and their return was requested May 14th, 2019. And everybody pretty much here in this room received their due diligence that we were asking these questions and we would need their help with their answer, including the Congressional Affairs Office. Here we are, 1 year later, and your office has still not submitted responses to our questions. And we need those responses by the end of the month. They help us work with you to do due diligence and using the taxpayers' dollars efficiently and wisely. So my question to you right now is, will you commit to getting those responses and providing them in a timely fashion so that we can move forward? And for any questions we have for the record for today's hearing.
I'll sure look into it and see that we can do that, absolutely.
Well, I would think that if you have people who work for you and they're not getting back to us and we're contacting the Congressional Affairs Office saying we need to hear back from you, that they have done you an extraordinary disservice by not getting us the information on time, or the other question is that they've been told that it's not important. Which is it?
Well, they are certainly inundated by government oversight requests that we're complying with as well, under threats of subpoena. So we prioritize all our work, and we'll go back and have a discussion about it.
Well, for the record, I have not subpoenaed anything. We are asking for due diligence and numbers to set a budget. I realize that you might have other committees doing other things, but my job is to work with Mr. Joyce and to work with our counterparts in the Senate and to come up with a meaningful budget that uses the taxpayers' funds in a wise manner, which they expect us to do. So I'm going to be very clear. I expect on budget requests to get answers back. And I want to put you on notice that we're going to have to be more assertive and more aggressive if we do not hear back in a timely fashion so we can work together to put forward a budget that uses the American taxpayers' dollars in a responsible way, moves forward with our due diligence in taking care of our national lands and being public stewards and protecting our cultural heritage. And so we're about getting the job done, as I know you have wanted to be, but to wait a year for a response for questions to me is totally unacceptable. I have another quick question, and it goes with science support. Fiscal year 2020, bill withholds $1 million from Fish and Wildlife Services Central Office operations until the service provides the committee with a report on cooperative landscape program. This measure was necessary because since fiscal year 2019, the committee has asked for this information and the service has failed to provide it. Do you intend to get this report submitted to us? It's been almost a year again, so that we can make a sound, prudent decision on how to best use the taxpayers' dollars. And if you can get the report submitted to us, how soon can we expect it delivered?
So I'm not familiar with the report. I'll go back and look at it.
Well, I would like to know when I'm going to hear back from you. You've said you're not familiar with the report. I don't want to wait another year to hear back from you.
Copy that.
So hear back from you in 2 or 3 weeks, the status of the report?
Well, I'll go down from the office. I'll go to the office this afternoon. I'll see what I can find out about the report. I'm happy to call you this evening.
That would be great. Thank you. Mr. Joyce.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Your budget includes $3 million to support the Task Force on Missing and Murdered American Indians and Alaska Natives, also known as Operation Lady Justice, established in November 2019 by President Trump. Can you talk a little bit about the objective of this task force and what you hope to achieve in fiscal year 21?
Well, I can give you some real-life examples. A few months ago, there was an unfortunate incident in Indian country, and we immediately had a task force out looking at the situation. My hope, this is for a long time, the primary focus of the task force is to ensure that the resources of justice and us are used wisely and together to make the maximum impact we can in this horrible area. The disproportionate impact to American Indian and Native Alaskan women compared to other parts of the country is remarkably horrible. And so the goal here with the president was to bring the resources of the federal government to that. And what I'm very hopeful for is that I hope we see some of these cases ultimately closed quicker, and that people have the ability to see outcomes and hope and see that we are deadly serious about addressing this horrific problem and doing it in a way that puts perpetrators away.
I had a hearing on that last year with our sexual violence task force. One of the areas that I heard of, I'm just throwing it out there, is the fact that getting into the DNA databases.
That's a very significant issue.
So we can take out the serial rapists.
And utilizing the DOJ resources with our resources and working together. Absolutely.
As the department's budget so eloquently states, expanding recreation and access on public lands helps strengthen the connection of Americans to these special places and brings economic opportunity to the neighboring gateway communities. Generally, when we think about increasing public access, we think about the modest amounts appropriated throughout the land acquisition account. I'm curious about the kind of strides that agencies are making to increase access within the context of making land management decisions. I understand you recently signed a secretarial order to that effect. Would you talk a little bit about your vision for increasing access through land management decisions and how you're measuring success?
Well, I'll give you a great example. We have made a very conscious effort to expand or open new hunting and fishing opportunities on our land. So, for example, within the Fish and Wildlife Service, over the last 3 years, we've opened or expanded new hunting and fishing opportunities on over 1.7 million acres of land. And our budget, you will notice, says we anticipate doing another 2 million acres of expanded or opened opportunities in this proposed budget. And I'm about to come out with a rule that I think will even be above that. Look, I grew up in a rural community surrounded by federal lands, and my family was very, to say our means were modest would be an understatement. And the joy that I had and the confidence that was created in me of having the opportunity to be out fishing and hunting was phenomenal. People are passionate about our lands. One of the things that I've also done is said for every sale, exchange, or transfer of any of our lands, I want to report on exactly what it does to public access opportunities, because a lot of times a small little 20-acre section can open or close thousands of acres to the public. And we are committed, the President is committed to expanding access opportunities across the board.
Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Mr. Kilmer.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thank you for being with us. For the fourth year in a row, the administration's proposed cutting support for the Climate Adaptation Science Centers, the CASCs, which play a pivotal role in supporting state and local and tribal community efforts to better predict and adapt to the growing impacts of climate change. Thankfully, Congress has continued to show broad bipartisan support for the 8 regional CASCs, which work across all 50 states to provide core science and technical assistance that these communities rely on to inform natural resource management decisions, to help with resilience planning efforts. In my neck of the woods, we're already seeing the impacts of climate change. I represent 4 coastal tribes that are in the process of trying to move to higher ground. We've seen catastrophic wildfires that threaten the health and safety of communities in the Pacific Northwest, changing ocean conditions, everything from increased acidification to harmful algal blooms are impacting our shellfish growers and our fisheries. Our region's largest employer is the Department of Defense. They look at climate change as a threat multiplier, and our Navy bases, as you likely know, are on the water, and they're seeing impact as well. It's for those reasons that CASCs exist. I am very grateful that the Northwest CASC, which is currently housed at the University of Washington, has provided technical assistance to communities throughout our region who are trying to make informed decisions about the future in a rapidly changing climate. As you know, Congress provided just over $38 million in fiscal year 2020 to support the 8 regional CASCs. Unfortunately, they've seen growing delays in the distribution of research dollars, which Congress has already appropriated to support the critical work they're doing. Those delays are extremely disruptive to ongoing research projects and ultimately undermine the CASC's ability to retain the scientific capacity necessary to support their mission. So my first question to you is, can you explain to the committee why your agency is continuing to delay the distribution of funds that Congress has appropriated?
Thank you for the question, sir. The answer is we're not. And to the extent that you have individual particular issue, I'd love to visit with you about that specifically, because here is Secretary Zinke did have a review process in place. We've really moved across the board to a grant solutions-based grant analysis. My concern with grants is not giving them or anything like that. I just want to make sure that we have the ability to track that they go for the purposes that they were utilized for, and that we can defend our expenditures when we come to the Inspector General. And so we have put in place a mechanism that has downgraded, not in a negative way, but lowered the level of approval for all of these grants, as long as we have the means to ensure that we have the ability to follow up on them. So I would be very surprised if you have a problem that's of recent vintage. You may have something that's older, and I appreciate that, but I'd be happy to look into it, because that should not be happening at this moment in time.
Can you tell us how long, on average, it takes your agency to review and approve a project that's been approved for funding by a CASC?
I can get you that information. I honestly don't have it in front of me.
Do you have a sense of how it compares to other DOI programs that are funded in the same manner?
So on that, I will speculate a little bit, but here's what I would say. I would be astounded if it takes longer. Astounded. So I'm happy to go back and look at that for you. We had a number of cooperative agreements and grants and other bureaus that clearly got caught up a couple years ago, and maybe even a year and a quarter ago. But we have downgraded that, and I don't think that should be occurring, and I'm happy to look at it for you.
Based on your comment, I think you understand when Congress appropriates funding, we expect your agency to administer those funds as instructed by Congress. Can you give us a commitment to approving and dispersing research funding in a timely manner consistent with the direction that we set?
Well, I also have programmatic responsibilities, like I need to make sure the money's going to the right place. It's more than just you passed a law and we just let the money out the door. We don't do that. And I can't make that commitment to you. I can commit to you that I will follow the law. I will do the programmatic reviews, and we'll make sure that money gets out the door on a timely manner, absolutely.
I have communities that are depending on that. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Good morning, Mr. Simpson. Do you have a question?
Certainly, I can think of one. I'm being in this room, I kind of want to ask about small modular reactors and EM cleanup and
Fire
a few things
away. I'll
like
give you any answer you ever wanted to hear from DOE.
In your budget request, I noticed that you requested $50 million for the full-time wildfire fighting workforce. As you know, wildfires have become a year-round job anymore. I think this is an interesting idea, and I also asked the Forest Service if they have interest in something similar, which it appears that they do. Can you explain to me how you see this full-time wildfire workforce operating? How will the $50 million be used? Salaries, standing up the program, or what? And most importantly, I'd like to remind you that the NIFC is in Boise, the Center for Wildfire Operations in this country, and it would make a lot of sense to base them there. Just throw that out.
First and foremost, let me say this. I started looking at our fire program largely at the beginning based on the fact that we hire a lot of seasonals, and it takes an enormous amount of time to get a seasonal in. And in this economy, that's tough. And our process is very slow. So when I looked at that, I realized that also our utilization of hours for seasonals, we really hold hours at the beginning of the season because we're worried about how aggressive the later part of the season will be, and we don't want to use, the bureaus didn't want to use their hours and be out of hours, if you will. And then as I looked at it, here's where, and I spent a lot of time with our folks, including folks in Boise, so that ought to give you some comfort. But our vision is this, that for certain positions that we've hired seasonally, we elevate to career hires. There's an attractiveness in that for the employee because they will receive benefits. It's a good thing to be a full-time employee. I have already gone to the Office of Personnel Management and had them expand the hours we have for our seasonals to basically give us an additional 3 months. Those two things together would basically give us an additional 700,000 hours a year in man hours to utilize for both fighting fires, but also treating fires before they occur. And I really believe fundamentally that we will save a lot of money if we do more treatments instead of fighting it at the back end. And I know there's an entire fire economical complex that benefits from these fires, but I would really like to move it into a methodology that makes more sense. I think it will save the taxpayer a lot of money over the long term. Everybody on this committee has a view about fire, and they may or may not have the same agreement on why the fire is occurring, but what they can agree on is we have more fires today than we've had in a long time. Our fuel load is greater than it has been in a while, and we need to do more treatment or fighting. So this should be something. This should be something that this committee can look at and say, hey, it's not a completely crazy idea, and it makes a lot of sense. Our practices here have to change from just doing the same thing over and over. So that's my plea with it. And I think there's $50 million in the Forest Service budget too, because the president was fair about this one. But it would go a long ways to make things better.
Appreciate that. I'm pleased to see your budget request included the Public Lands Infrastructure Fund. I believe we need to get serious about addressing the maintenance backlog in parks, BLM, refuges, and the National Forest. I also believe LWCF is important. That is why I introduced the Lands Act last Congress and again this Congress. Now with that a few years have gone by, I am pleased to see the President's tweet his support for the framework of LWCF and deferred maintenance funding together. I'm also pleased to see the Senate moving a bill along that I plan on being the co-lead on in the House version. Can you talk about the importance of these programs to the administration and their support for conservation?
Well, because you were at the other hearing, you didn't hear my opening, but here's what I would say. No president has ever supported mandatory funding for these two programs, ever. And the fact that he did is very, very significant. And it's historic. I mean, if you look back and say, look at conservation land investment, I think you'll see that the LWCF has been funded by this committee fully twice, maybe twice. And to fully fund it going forward is very significant. It would be a huge investment in lands, and it would be a huge investment in our national parks, which desperately need, everybody on this committee knows, that we need to do better in maintaining our park infrastructure, our infrastructure on BLM and Fish and Wildlife lands and our Indian schools. So I know you've been a leader on this issue for many years. I hope that this opportunity doesn't pass everybody by, because it is historic.
Thank you.
Ms. Pingree.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being with us here today. I think the last time you were before our committee, I asked you about climate change and your sort of general take on it, but I continue to be concerned that maybe you and I don't see this in the same way. So first off, let me just ask you again, I think I asked you last year, but are you currently of the mind that climate change is real and there's a man-made impact and it's part of the Department of Interior's responsibility to be engaged in fixing the problem?
Well, I certainly believe that the climate is changing. I believe that man is a significant contributor to that change. And I also believe that the Department of the Interior has a role in ensuring that we account for those things when we make decisions and work within the law as appropriate to utilize best science to make our decisions, absolutely.
Well, that's good. We see somewhat eye to eye on this, so that's good. Back to the question that Representative Quigley was asking, and this is on the New York Times article, which I found particularly disturbing, and recent information, and perhaps there are things in that article you disagree with, but according to the article, it said that language appeared in at least 9 reports, including impact statements and environmental studies, using this what's considered to be debunked language, uncertainty language in these reports. You mentioned earlier when he was talking to you about that there's a back and forth between experts, even though that debunked language said that increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is beneficial. I don't know of actual experts that say that. I've read that 97% of actively publishing scientists and those who publish in peer-reviewed journals would not agree with that statement. So I'm just curious, have you attempted to remove that uncertainty language from these reports? Do you see that as disturbing? Do you understand why that question has become so important to many of us?
Well, let me begin by saying factually, I'm happy to hand you an email exchange that lays out exactly what I'm talking about in terms of give and take, number one. Number two, uncertainty exists in a variety of frameworks, and you'll find that if we brought in USGS's best climate folks, here's what they would say to you. Here's what they would actually say to you. There's a degree of uncertainty regarding natural variability.
Natural what?
Variability. The system is very complex. There's a degree of uncertainty in whether or not the future projections in any one climate scenario is with any degree of precision. As a matter of fact, what they say actually is that in order to make a good decision and utilize climate data, what you should do, this is what they tell me to do as a best practice, is if you're going to look at future articulations of projections for climate, what you need to do is look at multiple models and multiple scenarios. You have a scenario, say, at 8.5, you have one at 6, you have one at 4.6, you have one at 2.5. Look at multiple models, look at multiple scenarios within each, look at multiple models within each scenario. So you have a range, because what they say, the experts say, is that no outcome is probable or more likely than the other. These are all plausible outcomes. And if you look at the IPCC itself, the report, you'll see that this very description of uncertainty is even discussed there. So the reality is questions about uncertainty exist. That doesn't mean that this information isn't good to utilize, to think through, inform, and be informed when you make a decision. But when you are going to make a decision, you really need to use the best practices. And I don't make these best practices up. I go ask the experts, what should our best practices be? And then what I tend to tell people is, I think you ought to be using our best practices. Why? Because they're the best practices.
Well, unfortunately, I'm going to run out of time for this question, but I would love to see the email change that you mentioned. I would love to have more specific information about who are the top scientists at the USGS who are actually arguing this point. I will certainly rush home and rush back to my office. I'd love to rush home, but I'm not going to. And look at the IPCC report.
Google the word uncertainty in it, or search it, and you'll see it pops up a whole bunch.
I will. I doubt that I will see anywhere that a reputable scientist, is saying that increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is beneficial.
So I try to avoid arguing with you about that point, and I'm not asking you to agree with this, but there are definitely people, scientists, who believe that the Earth is greening more than it's browning because of increased carbon dioxide, and that's a good thing. I'm not articulating that as my position, but as a matter of fact, there are scientists who feel very strongly about that.
Well, I'm also going to rush back and
Do that.
look for those scientists.
You can even YouTube it. My kids showed me. You can YouTube it, and they'll come
Yeah,
up.
and some of what you see on YouTube is real and some isn't. But just lastly, I will say, and I'll probably have another chance, but you make an incredible number of extremely important decisions, and I think it's critically important that you are using the best science possible, and I have concerns that you're possibly not. So I'll yield back, leave it there.
Ms. Lawrence?
Thank you for being here, Secretary. The Department of Interior plays a critical role in the preservation of public lands across the country, including more than 400 acres under the National Park System. Additionally, the Interior Department oversees the conservation and development of the the National Heritage Areas, including Motor City's National Heritage Area in my hometown of Detroit, Michigan. A collaboration with the National Park Services allows Motor City National Heritage Area to inspire visitors to learn about the enormous impact the development of the automotive industry had on Southeast Michigan, ranging more than 10,000 square miles in southwest and central Michigan. The Department of Interior also plays a critical role in the preservation of landmarks across the country. For example, in 2017, Wayne County, which I represent, received funds from the African American Civil Rights Grant Program to begin renovations of the historic Hamtramck Station that was the home of the Detroit Stars of the Negro League in the 20th century. So across the United States, the national park and heritage sites are major tourist destinations for visitors from all over the world. In fact, the mission of the National Park Service includes ensuring that we have these natural and historical objects protected for generations. However, once again, President Trump's budget proposed major cuts to the Department of Interior, including the National Park Service. One of my concerns is that we're not doing enough. With the President proposed drastic budget cuts to the National Park and Interior Department, my question to you, Mr. Secretary, is how does the department have the resources necessary to protect more than 400 acres? And what about local programs such as the National Heritage Area that the National Park helps support through federal funds?
Well, one of the things I am excited about is the President has been very clear and has submitted in this budget a legislative proposal that would address a significant portion of the maintenance backlog of our national parks through a funding mechanism that now other members of Congress and the Senate have introduced, and I expect to see introduction in the House of joining both LWCF and the parks restoration bills together. So I think we're on good ground there. I will also tell you one of the disappointments I have in this budget personally is, and I think that is probably, I'm a big fan, let me just say it this way, I'm a big fan of heritage areas. I always have been. I believe they're a good bang for the buck. I think they're great for local collaboration, and I know our budget doesn't reflect that. Our budget is focused on really focused on taking care of the things the parks currently have.
Quickly, I have a question about the climate adaptive science centers. Can you confirm that you're carrying out development of the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center? And what's the timeline for starting up the center? Because the budget proposed eliminating funding for all but one national center.
Right, so the 2021 budget proposes to integrate 8 science centers into one. Several members of your committee have expressed that that's not acceptable to them, but that is what is proposed.
So when it comes to the budget eliminating for tribal climate centers, absent this information, how does the tribes and the communities to be able to make informed decisions about our migration, our climate coverage change when it comes to, you're not addressing it in the budget for the tribal communities?
Well, it's my understanding that right now there are 8 universities that administer the regional centers, and they are the University of Alaska, the University of Washington, the University of Colorado at Boulder, the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, the University of Arizona, the University of Hawaii, the University of Oklahoma, and North Carolina State. Those are the 8 that I'm aware of. If there's others, I don't think there are others, but there might be others that I'm not aware of.
So,
What happens with tribes historically is the centers work with states and tribes, and that work would continue. It would just be done through a different center.
I yield back.
In 1920, the Great Lakes Climate Center Research Center was enacted. And so when Congress enacts something, there's an expectation that it will be stood up. So I think you've heard from the committee on this. I want to go back to my earlier remarks and to a comment that you made. I believe it was clearly directed at me. I want to be clear. I've never stood in the way of making sure that we get the right people in the field to do the job at the right time. But when there are major reorganizations taking place, Congress has a job, and that's a job to do due diligence, to understand the full impacts to the taxpayer, to the mission of an agency that's going to be reorganized, and to ask questions and to get cost-benefit analysis and other such answers. In August of 2019, this committee did so about the BLM reorganizations. But today, I'm just going to ask a couple of questions, Mr. Secretary, concerning the move of the BLM headquarters out of Washington, D.C., particularly the underlying rationale. On July 16th of last year, the House and Senate Appropriations Committees received a letter from the Department's Assistant Secretary of Land and Minerals Management. In that letter, Congress was told that the lease on the Bureau satellite office on M Street here in the district could not be renewed. And we were very explicitly told, and I quote from that, "A renewed lease for M Street is not an option as the new rate would exceed would exceed $50 per square foot." A month later, on September 10th, the BLM's Deputy Director for Policy and Programs testified before the House Committee on Natural Resources, and he said, without a qualification, that a renewed lease for M Street location is not an option as the rate would exceed $50 per square foot. Despite these assertions, on October 15th, the General Services Administration, GSA, which handles office leases for government agencies, received a letter from a commercial real estate firm representing the owner of the M Street building. The letter from the real estate firm acknowledged the expiration date of BLM's lease, but in their letter they said, and I quote from it, "We have not heard from GSA." The letter went on to say, and I quote from it, quote, "The purpose of this unsolicited offer is to clarify any misunderstanding and to make clear that both the office space is available and that we are well within the prospectus limit caps." End of quote. And that means it was in the $50 per square foot limit. Based on additional information to this committee, I believe GSA has never contacted the building owner to ask about a renewed lease, which is true, completely undercuts the truthfulness of the department's statements. So my questions are, what was the basis for the assertion that the M Street lease could not be renewed and that the renewed lease at M Street location would exceed the $50 per square foot limit? Are you aware of any communications between the department, GSA, asking GSA to begin these lease negotiations with the owners of the M Street building? And at what direction did you personally give to anyone at the department or BLM with respect to renewing the M Street lease? And who in the department or BLM would have the most information on efforts made to renew the lease? So I repeat the first question. What was the basis for the assertion that the M Street leases could not be renewed and that the renewed lease at M Street location would exceed the $50 per square foot limit.
So let me take them in reverse order. The $50, I'd have to get back to you. It's my understanding that was from GSA, but I'm happy to look at that. I believe that it was. But let me be clear. I expressed to the Bureau that I had no intention of redoing the lease. So at the end of the day, I was not going to renew the lease.
Well, you're certainly entitled to say that you did want to look at renewing a lease, but when we are asking questions to find out the underpinning for why the move was made, and there were many reasons, and you have stated them to me why you think it was a good move. And there's as I said, I think moving some of the personnel closer is a good idea. But when Congress is told that the main reason for the move is because the lease could not be renewed at an acceptable rate, in other words, the rate would exceed, and it's put in a letter and given to Congress at the $50 per square foot, you can see where the rest of the argument starts to come into question about the move and why we have asked repeatedly for information and the fact, and I do appreciate the table that you shared the other day. Some of the information was outdated, as you pointed out. But, you know, when we're asking for something to understand why something's happening, it's so we can be accountable to our constituents when they ask us.
So I appreciate that, Chair McCollum. Let me say this on the $50. I have never been told that it was anything other than the $50, and I will go back and look at that. But I do want to be clear with you. I was not going to renew the lease, and I'm sure I expressed that to many people in the building. So if that's a fact. But I'm happy to go look at the $50. I have never heard of it being a rate anything other than above what GSA set as its standard.
So, Mr. Secretary, to say my concerns on this is outrageous, when we might have been given inaccurate, maybe even out-and-out false information about why the move had to occur, I don't think I'm being outrageous. I just think I'm doing my job.
I appreciate that. That's your view.
So I also asked you if you're aware of any communications between the department and GSA. You're not.
Well, it's my understanding there were communications, but was not personally involved in those communications.
And so the only direction that you personally had given to people is you had no intention of renewing the lease.
Absolutely.
So who in the department would have the most information on how to renew the lease? Because we would like this information.
Well, on the decision?
Yes.
So it's my view that I was not going to renew the lease, so that would be me.
Who in the department or BLM would have the most information on the efforts made to renew the lease on M Street? Because there was information given.
I don't know if there were any
There was
efforts.
information given to Congress twice that a renewed lease on M Street is not an option as the new rate would exceed the $50 per square foot. That was submitted to Congress. That was given to us. That was the rationale why this was taken. So who do we talk to in the Department of BLM?
Well, I can go back and ask who was involved in any discussions, if there were any, with GSA. I just don't know the answer to that.
And can you get back to us with the name of that individual tomorrow?
Well, I'll go look at it. I'll go look into it. And look, I'm saying very clearly, if you want to know the answer to the question of why there's not going to be a renewal of the lease, I'm telling you, I'm not going to do it.
That's not what I asked you, sir, with all due respect. I heard you loud and clear. We had people, both to the House and Senate Appropriations Committee, who received a letter from the Assistant Secretary for Land Management and Minerals when we were asking questions. And that person stated in a letter to us, to Congress, that the rationale wasn't that you weren't going to renew the lease, you were going to look for something else, was that M Street was not an option, and I quote from the letter, as the new rate would exceed the $50 per square foot. That was the rationale we were given. And if that assumption
I
for
understand
that
your
is
issue.
wrong and is false, I want you to understand that asking more information and trying to understand is not being outrageous.
I've
It's
never-
doing due diligence.
I have never heard it being any number other than the 50. I will go back and look to find out who and what was said, and we'll get back to you on it.
When?
Well, soon.
Well, soon, as I
Soon
said
is all you're
earlier, it's
gonna
been a
get.
year. So, a week?
Soon.
A month?
I don't know.
A month's not soon. A week's
I
soon.
would think that that's probably true. It's not soon. I'll go back, I'll look into it, I'll get back to you.
Mr. Joyce?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I know we all share the same goal of eradicating Asian carp in the Mississippi River Basin and preventing their spread to the Great Lakes. So I want to check in with you about the status of the efforts and the workload and funding needed to ensure that we meet our goal. Because once we do, the need for continued federal funding presumably will go way down. So my question is about the proposed cuts in the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Geological Survey budgets for Asian carp. Are these proposed cuts simply a reflection of the constrained budget environment, or is there another rationale for scaling back the federal role at this juncture? And before you start, when we talked about Chairman, or my dear friend Chairman Simpson will take over, or Ranking Member of Energy and Water Simpson would take over, and I'm going to, after this question, go relieve Mr. Amadei, your worst nightmare, to come back here and ask you some more questions of what's going to take place.
So let me say, there is a reduction, you're right. At the same time, there was a large infusion last year, and they haven't spent, we're on the spend down program. So but there's some very exciting stuff happening on genetic detection, on, I'm going to get these all wrong because they're USGS and they're probably above my pay grade, but on utilizing electric fields. They're doing some really neat stuff. And I know that this is a priority for both of you. It's a priority for a lot of folks in the Senate too. And I think that there's some really exciting stuff that's going to happen. But it was largely a question of, given the resources we have and how long it was actually going to take them to spend the money.
You're right in that extent. There's other, as we find out, Tennessee, Kentucky, other states that
That's right, there are.
unfortunately experience the same issues with these Asian carp. So it's just like with the GLRI, we're in what we've done with harmful algal blooms. We're sort of leading the nation in trying to fix a problem.
So I'm really hopeful that, with some species, they've been able to find a treatment that just, you put it in the water and affects that, and that's it. There's still a ways from that, honestly, with this particular species.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Mr. Kilmer?
Thanks, Madam Chair. I want to echo the ranking member's appreciation for action on murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. I think that is a very important issue. On top of that, there are serious shortcomings that were identified in the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights Broken Promises report, and wanted to get a sense from you, one, whether you've had an opportunity to read that report, and if you can speak to what you and your department are doing to address some of the shortcomings that were identified by the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights.
So I'll be very honest with you, I have not read that report. I'm happy to read it and look at it.
I would be grateful if you could. It speaks to consistent and disproportionate shortages in federal funding for tribal communities, for tribal natural resource management compared to non-tribal programs, insufficient support for treaty rights, and I would love to get a sense from you of what the department is doing to address those shortcomings.
Happy to look at it.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Mr. Simpson?
Thank you. Let me ask you about another subject that's near and dear to my heart. Recently, a judge ordered, and I believe unfairly, tipped his hand that the sage-grouse plans need to return to the Obama-era plans. This is obviously concerning to the western states who are in favor, in fact, in a bipartisan way, of your directive to better align the management plans with the states. In my opinion, it used the best available science and mitigated for the most eminent threats such as wildfire. For this very reason, I'm pleased you requested the listing prohibition in your budget request, because I believe the litigation like this is getting in the way of making sound scientific decisions. Can you explain how this decision by the judge is impacting your ability to move forward with the state-based plans, and can you shed some light on this process and discuss some of the complications litigation will create on conserving sage-grouse?
Yes. So one of the first things I was asked to do by Secretary Zinke when I was deputy is look at these plans and work with the states, and we reached an agreement. By the way, with all 7 states, blue states and red state governors, we all came to an alignment. That said, this judge decided that we hadn't taken a hard enough look. He decided that as a preliminary matter in a preliminary injunction. He hasn't ruled on the merits. But what we've done is taking the judge's word. NEPA requires us to take a hard look if he thinks we didn't. We have gone out with a supplemental environmental impact statement and sought comments on those issues that he's identified as problematic. We'll take the comment, and my goal is that we have it, we take the hard look that he thinks he needed, that we needed to do, and we make a decision very quickly. And so that's out. We've gone out with proposals. Those proposals are out for comment, and we'll be expeditious in acting. My goal is to ensure that we have fully complied with the law and have plans that the governors are behind and that we all can be behind, and will do positive things. The changes that were made to the prior plans were not terribly significant. They're very important to the governors. They're very important to the public. But we ensured that the plans were very, very protective for sage-grouse. And so I continue to believe that the plans are the right way forward, and we'll go through the process, do the hard work. And I'm excited. I expect that we'll be back in front of the judge with the completed NEPA, and he can take a second look at it. So that's my goal, is to get there as fast as humanly possible.
So the no sage-grouse listing provision that you requested is so that you can get through this process?
Well, and it's also, frankly, there has been a tremendous investment by states, by nonprofits, by even ranchers. I mean, a lot of people have made a tremendous investment in sage-grouse management. And it seems backwards in my mind, where you have this massive effort that's gone on for 15 years, maybe longer. We have a plan that folks really support. We believe that it's based on sound science, and there is no reason to add to that a listing that's probably unnecessary. So my view is that language should remain in your bill. I mean, I know what you do with my thoughts, but that's my view.
Thank you. A couple of things. Don't have a question on this, and I don't have an ask today, but I would like to continue the dialogue with your department, the EPA, and other partners such as the tribes, Shoban tribes, the state of Idaho, and industry, to see if we can find some common ground for cleanup in the area of the future and the future of the greater Pocatello and Fort Hall area on the Gay Mine. Secondly, I would just state that I hope you and the chairwoman can work out the differences on this BLM move and stuff, because frankly, I think it's a good idea to get people that manage the land out closer to the land. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Ms. Pingree.
Thank you. First, I just want to say I appreciate, you made some remarks earlier about dealing with some of the national parks backlog, and I know it's something that this committee, in a very bipartisan way, is committed to, so that even though there is a significant cut in the budget, I hope that our committee will move forward on that, as you know, and we're grateful that you've been to visit the state of Maine. We have Acadia National Park, which is up near the top in visitors, but we have a 7% cut already in this budget, and huge backlog, $66 million, according to the latest data. And I believe you understand that that's important, and I appreciate that you've mentioned it. But of course, I need to go back to climate change. I think this is one of those things that was quite a significant example to me of how you and I see this differently on the Alaska Wildlife Refuge drilling. In the final environmental impact statement for the leasing program on the coastal plain of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, the BLM said that there isn't a climate crisis, which I thought was very surprising, especially since this is at odds with a report done by the USGS, where you have said that there are scientists who see this differently. But the USGS on Alaska, in coordination with the University of Alaska, determined that the land in Alaska make up approximately 18% of the nation's total area. They contain about 53% of the carbon stock, and that's just not just the forest, that includes also the wetlands and undisturbed tundra. So if we were on the same page on climate change, I think you would be looking at this through the lens of understanding that we do have to manage our public lands for the lands that they are there, that it's extremely important to have healthy ecosystems that can sequester carbon and methane and nitrogen, and that we need to, as well as lowering our emissions from fossil fuels, we need to pull a lot of the carbon out of the atmosphere. Do you agree with any of that, and why are you at disagreement with this report that from the USGS and the University of Alaska? Did I make sense?
I'm not going to say no to whether you made sense or not. I'm just not sure.
In my
I'm
mind,
not
I
sure
did.
I understand what exactly your question is specifically.
Well, first off, the BLM said there isn't a climate crisis. I don't understand that at all. Second, a fundamental is that we have too much carbon in the atmosphere. Well, we have to stop our use or reduce our use of fossil fuels. We have to pull a lot of it out. And one of the most important ways to do that is sequestering it in the natural lands that we have. And if, in fact, according to the USGS, that this land is about 18% of the nation in area and 53% of our carbon stock, which even I find a high number, how can we possibly justify the decisions that have been made if this is an incredibly important carbon sink?
So I think where the disconnect begins and frankly probably ends is in your role as a member of Congress, you can dictate to me through law whatever you want to do on these public lands. I'm a firm believer that the property clause of the Constitution puts those lands within your jurisdiction. You can decide if we want parks. You can decide if we want fossil fuel leasing. You can decide whatever you want. My job is a little bit different, and my job, particularly as it relates to the 1002 area of ANWR, is to do what Congress told me to do. And in that particular area, Congress has specifically said to us, you will do a lease sale, 2 lease sales, within a date certain, and get on with it. And so the question is not should we do one thing or the other. The question is, we're going to have a leasing program. What should that leasing program look like? Recognizing what Congress has done. And what Congress did with these provisions is they've created really extraordinary grants if they're ever leased. These would be leases that mandate a certain amount of acreage be authorized. They mandate that rights of ways be granted. It's a very significant conference of rights in our bundle, in the bundle of rights, if we ever have leases sought.
Okay, I
And
have to
so,
stop you there.
I want to be really clear about
I
this.
do
That's where
understand.
the disagreement.
I
I'm
hear
not
what
a
you're saying.
disagreement, but that's where the
gentlewoman's reclaiming her time.
And I'm almost out of time anyway, but I totally understand, and I actually think that last year you and I came upon the same disagreement about you enacting the law, in your opinion, and me thinking that you have a much broader responsibility on protecting our public land. So just very quickly, the UN Convention on Biodiversity outlined a critical goal of protecting at least 30% of the planet for nature because of our loss of biodiversity, and again, I think because of the importance of having a carbon sink. But your budget proposes to reduce the funding for USGS, which is our most important science agency, by $300 million, which is a 24% reduction. How are we going to do that without the capacity there and the funding there to have this premier science?
One thing I would encourage your committee to do is look across the board at all of the investments that you're making in climate research at EPA, at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, at the USGS. Whether you like our proposal or not, I think it would be really good to get a handle on the reality that I have professors that are getting 5, 10, 15 grants on virtually the same thing from a wide variety of federal agencies. And I do think that would be something to look at and really make sure you're getting the bang for the buck that you want.
And I certainly appreciate that we do not want duplicative research that isn't being shared, but on the other hand, I don't think we have anywhere near enough research or capacity right now, so I'm not interested in cutting that funding. But thank you again. I yield back.
So, going back to the, to ANWR and the drilling revenues, you rightly laid out what Congress in a bill charged you to do, but let's be clear, that passed because Congress was told that the American taxpayer would receive $725 million in leasing revenue in 2021 fiscal years. And that's just the federal share. With Alaska would receiving a similar amount, the full estimate from the lease was closer to $1.5 billion. So that lease was to pay for President Trump's tax policies, his tax cuts. So do you not have a responsibility in moving forward with those leases to make sure that that commitment to the taxpayers and to Congress is also honored? So my first question regarding the estimate of the department providing a complete supporting documentation for how you arrived at the number of $1.5 billion. For some reason, we don't have any budget justification for that. How that number came to be.
So I believe the first-year lease sale number is exactly the same as the CBO number. I'd have to get back to you on the second-year number, and I'm happy to do that. Whatever explanation we have, you can have.
So if you're confident of that number, why is the administration unwilling to support a minimum bid to protect the American taxpayer?
So, well, let me. I have not. First off, I haven't suggested that I'm confident or not confident in that number. What my belief is, and we haven't made the record of decision yet. But my belief is that these leases that, as Congress contemplated, the leases that would be conferred if a program is established and people come and bid, I think the rights conferred under these leases are extraordinary. They guarantee rights away.
Okay,
They guarantee 2,000 acres to be covered.
You explained that to Ms. Pingree.
So they're really extraordinary. So I feel like once they're understood, we're likely to have robust.
Reclaiming my time, sir, because I also have limited time. So I think we have a responsibility to honor the commitment that was told to the taxpayers for that. On the Office of Special Trustee, in 2016, Congress passed the Indian Trust Reassessment Act reform, and it had a provision requiring the Secretary to prepare consultation with the Indian tribes on a report on a transition plan timetable for the termination of the Office of Special Trustee to occur not later than 2 years after the date of submission. Instead of terminating the Office of Special Trustee, the President's 2021 budget proposes to rename the agency and to permanently locate it within the Bureau of Indian Affairs as a separate bureau. So have you spoken to the tribes about what they would like to see happen under the Indian Trust Asset Reform Act on the determination of the Office of Special Trustee, because we were hearing from them in the past, they were not happy with the lack of discussions and some of the discussions that were taking place. So where are you with the status of the report required by the Indian Trust Asset Reform Act? It's years overdue. Are you consultating with the tribes? Are you ready to enter in a dialogue with Congress on how to achieve the goal?
So I'm happy to find out where the report is. I don't know.
Okay.
But I do believe fundamentally that the functions of the special trustee and the investment that we've made over many years to ensure that the functions are carried out in ways that are very, very good. All of those functions need to remain. For example, we need to make sure we have lock boxes. We need to make sure that money is invested quickly. We need to make sure that it can be, that the funds can be well managed. The government as a whole has invested a tremendous amount of money in improving our Indian trust financial management system. And the one thing I don't want to see is anything go backward in any meaningful way.
Well, I think consultation is something that, you know, that this committee takes very serious. So we would like to work with you in engaging with the tribes to make sure that there's full consultation, as it is affecting them directly, and as we would with any other governmental organization. Mr. Simpson, we are waiting for Mr. Amade, but I'd be curious as if you had another question for the Secretary.
I have a statement more than a question. I wasn't going to talk about this, but you brought it up. It's something that is a pet peeve of mine. And it deals with the climate change, and I'm someone who believes that the climate is changing. I'm not a Neanderthal. One of my pet peeves with the government, and I guess Ms. Pingree brought it up more than anything else, is that nobody can tell me in this government how much money we're spending on climate change. After 9/11, whenever anybody came into my office, we had the word Homeland Security in their budget request. So that if you wanted to grow corn in Iowa, we were doing it for Homeland Security reasons or something else. You know, that was the key phrase. Then climate change became the key phrase. And every agency that I know of requests money to study climate change. We put some into the Forest Service, we put some into the BLM, we put some into the, you know, on and on and on. And nobody can tell me what the total amount is we're spending on climate change, or if there is any duplication or anything else that's going on. Does the Park Service really need money to study climate change in the parks, and the Forest Service need it to study climate change in the boundaries just outside the park? I'm not sure it affects those two things differently. And I've thought for years it would be a good idea if we assigned one agency, and I thought the USGS, where we pool all this money together and say, okay, this is the resources we've got, we're going to study climate change with. And if the Forest Service wants to do something to study climate change, it goes through the USGS, and they make sure that it's not a duplicative thing, that it can be used by other agencies and so forth and so on. And if the Defense Department wants to look at climate change and the impact it's going to have on our defense in the future, then it goes through all of this kind of stuff so that there's more coordination. And it's just been a pet peeve of mine over the years that we haven't been able to do that and get more, I think, coordination and understanding of the amount of money that we spend on climate change, because I think it's a lot more than most people understand.
The number would be jaw-dropping, and whether you want to have the National Science Foundation run these grants, whether you want to have them sent to EPA or wherever, people should recognize that a lot of other science is not going to occur because everybody loves doing this science, and that's fine, and that's your priority. You've decided it's your priority. But if you looked at it across the board, I think you'd find the number to be shocking.
Thank you.
Mr. Simpson, I wasn't surprised you brought that up. I do believe there needs to be coordination, but I firmly believe understanding what's going on with our climate and to the best of our ability, our nation, as we as individuals band together to literally, I believe, save our planet for future generations. This is something of extraordinary significance. I'm going to submit a couple other questions for the record for you. I'm kind of going to say these out loud to give Mr. Amade just a second if he's running over here to come in the door, because I know he'll probably have a question. But if we don't see him, Mr. Secretary, we are not going to keep you any longer.
We've already talked about sage-grouse, so.
We did talk about sage-grouse, and I think I'll touch in one of my questions.
We haven't talked about wild horses, though.
I'm getting there.
Oh, you are? Oh, good, because we have a...
Hold on to your horses.
All right.
Okay, so, but first, I'm going to be submitting a question on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, some questions on the information of Freedom Act staffing. You've been in the district court on that, and some things just to kind of see how you're coming along with staffing. Ms. Lowy and I have had some serious letters exchanged and asked some very specific questions on international grants for Fish and Wildlife Service. We know that there were some issues raised and concerns, and I don't think anyone would ever question Ms. Lowy's or my human rights record here in Congress or outside of these halls. So we are anxious to get to the bottom of whatever's holding up these grants. And then we do have several questions on BLM wild horse and burrow management. For example, really briefly to kind of give you an idea of what we're looking for, because we'd like to get it back as soon as possible as we're putting the budget together. When's BLM going to submit the work plan required by the 2020 appropriations language, including a full discussion of staffing levels, which, you know, we're concerned might be in very dire shape? When does BLM plan to brief the subcommittee on the 2021 request for $4? And, you know, basically, when we expect the details on the $5 billion proposal to deal with this? We've received nothing since our questions were first raised in early October, and the department is proposing to add an additional $15 million to the program. The budget says extra money will be used to implement high-priority work to better prepare for future years. So we need to know what that is. We need to know what the tails are. We need to know what's going to happen with staffing. We want to be a partner in this. This is something that this committee has worked on in a very, nonpartisan fashion now on this. So I will close with this. Mr. Secretary, I know we asked you a lot of questions. We asked you about a few things, as you said, prior to you having the Secretariat. But yet you were serving in the administration under Mr. Zinke. I don't think it's unreasonable for us to want to have answers to questions. We're a check and a balance. I would like to move more towards the balance and less of having to do the check. And that means the balance of our questions get answered in a timely fashion. So you know what the questions are. If you can't get to them all at once, that's fine. Just let the committee know what order we can expect them in. And without seeing Mr. Amade, Mr. Simpson, any further? With that, we will conclude this hearing, and we will stand adjourned until we hear from the Smithsonian Institution's budget hearing tomorrow, and that will be on March 12th. Thank you.